What was the effect of the second bank on the U.S. economy, and why was Andrew Jackson so opposed to it?
Well, Jackson considered himself a Jeffersonian, and so he thought the bank was unconstitutional. He thought the bank was guilty of playing favorites, that it was a vehicle for partisan politics by the other party. And then he had seen the Panic of 1819, in which one commentator said the bank was saved because it contracted credit when it became close to suspending payments. When it came close to running out of gold, it just stopped rolling over loans, just had loans being paid back to build its reserves back up. So one commentator said, well, the bank was saved, but the people were ruined. And then the bank, after the panic was over, started expanding again. There's another panic in 1825-26. So it was adding to the cyclicality. It was creating booms and busts in the U.S. economy, and that became an important argument against it. So the friends of the bank said, without the bank, nobody will regulate the currency. And the critics of the bank said, well, look at what a terrible job it's done. It's not regulating the currency, it's making the currency less regular. So Jackson was in favor of severing the federal government's connection with the bank and then not renewing the charter when the charter came up. So even before the charter was due for renewal, he had withdrawn the federal government's deposits. The proponents of the bank thought that it was popular. I don't know why they thought that, but they actually put the charter up for renewal early instead of 1836 when it was going to run out. They put it up to a vote in Congress in 1832. They passed it, and they dared Jackson to veto the renewal, and he vetoed it, and that became his number one campaign issue. I slayed the monster, vetoed the recharter of the bank. And if you read the campaign literature from that year, it's remarkably literate. People knew more about banking then than I think you find in most newspapers today. Some economic historians think Jackson was kind of a yahoo and he was just foolish to kill the bank. He had a good theory and he had good arguments, and he had theorists on his side. I mean, he wasn't the theorist himself. But the people who are advising him, they, following the debate in Great Britain over the Bank of England, they understand that free banking is better than a central banking system. And so I don't think it was an unsophisticated position at all. It was actually quite sophisticated.
Well, the line that you hear from those folks now is that the abolition of the second bank created a huge panic in 1837. And, when I had George Selgin on the show, he mentioned that, that was really a result of state banking laws. I've also heard it mentioned, again, going back to the Bank of England, that the way that the Bank of England reacted to the abolition of the second bank may have played a role in that. So I just would like your own take. What caused the Panic of 1837?
Well, the Bank of the United States had expanded credit up to 1836. And so they were in one of those booms that couldn't last because they're starting to lose gold reserves, and they had to contract credit to avoid defaulting on their obligations. Now, I believe the Bank of England was doing the same thing. That is, they were also contracting credit at that time, which would raise interest rates in London, which would help attract gold from the United States to invest it in London where interest rates were higher. So that may have boosted it, boosted the export of gold and the contraction in the banking system. But I would blame it mostly on the previous overexpansion, which I lay at the feet of the Bank of the United States under the leadership of Nicholas Biddle. It's interesting to note that after the charter renewal was defeated, the Bank of the United States switched to having a state of Pennsylvania charter, and without its special connection with the federal government, it was only 3 years in 1839 that the Bank of the United States failed. So Biddle was seemingly not a very good banker. He was a very good politician, or knew how to get favors from Congress, but left on his own devices, he wasn't a very good banker.
The Civil War really was a driving factor in what created the need, or I guess the pretense for the U.S. government getting involved in banking after that point. But just focusing on that period, what's called the free banking era in the U.S., How free
Yeah.
was it? I mean, were these state banking laws really taking the role of what the federal government was doing? Was it a free banking era?
So the coincidence between the states passing what were called free banking laws, when I write that in print, I always put quotation marks around it to indicate so-called free banking, because it wasn't like Scottish free banking. It wasn't as minimally regulated. So these are state laws because states control the banking system. They make entry freer, so anybody who meets the criteria can get a bank charter. But there are strict criteria. In particular, the bank had to have a certain amount of capital. And in most states, well, maybe all of them, that adopted these kind of laws, the bank had to buy a certain amount of approved debt to serve as a redemption fund for their banknotes, so to serve as a kind of collateral. And the state of New York was one of the pioneers in this. And what they said was, if you want to issue banknotes, you have to back it with state of New York debt. So they used it as a device for selling state debt to the banking system. And that was a problem when state debt went into default, as it could. So there were problems in some states that didn't value the collateral properly, or without meaning to, encourage banks to concentrate in a single kind of asset, namely state debt, which when it failed, the banking system failed. So most notorious cases were Minnesota and Wisconsin, which allowed banks to back their notes with the bonds of other states, and they overvalued the bonds. That is, they valued them at their face value instead of their market price. So the banks said, well, we want to back the notes as cheaply as possible. They went out and bought Missouri bonds. Missouri, everybody knew the Civil War was coming. Missouri was going to break up, probably because it was divided between the slave part and the free part. So the Missouri bonds were quite cheap because there was a high risk of them not being repaid. When the Civil War broke out, the bonds plummeted even further in value, and something like 3/4 of the banks in Wisconsin and Minnesota became insolvent, had to be wound up. So that was an instability caused by the way the collateral rules were written. The free entry part worked well, and in the decades between New York adopting it in 1838, and Michigan actually jumped the gun and adopted it in 1837 by borrowing a copy of the bill that was under consideration in New York and passing it first. Between 1837 and the Civil War, most states eventually adopted these kind of free entry plus mandatory bond collateral banking laws, which were called free banking laws. So it couldn't have been too much of a disaster if you see the use of it spreading. And it wasn't until the Civil War arrived and a lot of the collateral became worthless because it was bonds of states that were in rebellion or on the border. So that was a problem. A problem due to the way the laws were restricting the banks rather than the freedoms they were giving the banks. The coincidence between it beginning in 1837 and the Bank of the United States charter ending in 1836, it's just a coincidence. There isn't any necessary connection between the two. If the Bank of the United States charter had been renewed, you still could have had states adopting these laws, and vice versa. If it hadn't been renewed, that doesn't necessitate states passing these laws.